Everybody, it's Gavin here from GCRE TV. Good day to you all and hope you all are well. Today's show, we're going to be doing with Mauricio Rauld from the Premier Law Group based in California, USA. Mauricio is going to talk about the three biggest mistakes that syndicators make when setting up a fund or putting a pool of people together when creating a fund and how to comply with the SEC rules so that you don't get fined. Mauricio, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Gavin. Thanks for having me.
Good. It's always good, as always, to have you on this show. As you know, this is the first of a few shows to come in the future, so we look forward to that. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. It's election or post-election day. Nobody knows what's going on, so a lot of fun over here.
Oh, every call I've had today, people are like, "So, what do you think is going on?" What the Europeans probably think that the Americans are mad, right, or crazy people. I go, well, what can I say? Europe. We have our own problems over here as well.
Yeah, everybody's got their issues, man. Everybody's got their issues.
Definitely. So today, Mauricio, we're gonna call this a fund syndication show with Mauricio, and it's about the three biggest mistakes that syndicators make and how to avoid them, so that they don't get fined by the SEC. So I think it should be a really good topic for a lot of people. This is going to be really good information for them because a lot of people aren't aware that sometimes when they put in together a pool of money, sometimes that they actually have to comply with certain rules. And even for us as well, right now, we're about to launch a show early next year. And this question has come up as well. Like, are we going to be an investor? Are we going to be a partner in the show? So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say today. So I'll hand over the reins to you and let you do your spiel, and then we'll talk after this shortly.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Gavin. This is something that comes up quite a bit for us, especially in my business where most syndicators are actually real estate investors, right? So they're buying real estate and somehow the securities laws come up. And so there's always a disconnect. And so before I go into sort of the three biggest mistakes, I want to let's just go right into it. Actually, let's do this. Let's go right into it. The number one mistake that I see from beginner first-time investors all the way through seasoned investors or syndicators is not realizing that they're issuing securities. Meaning, again, it kind of makes sense for beginners, right? You're buying real estate or you're doing something else. Like, why is the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission here in the US, in my business? Why are they even involved if I'm just buying real estate? And the reason for that is because the definition of a security is really broad under the SEC, and it doesn't just include stocks, bonds, mutual funds, but it includes, tenants in common agreements, profit sharing agreements, promissory notes, obviously, handshakes, side agreements, high fives. The structure itself doesn't matter, and that's the issue. The times you're issuing a security is anytime you're taking money from passive investors where the returns are being generated by your efforts. You're doing all the work. You're selling securities. It doesn't matter whether it's in an entity, in a corporation, in a limited liability company. It doesn't matter if there's a formal contract or not. The fact that you're the one generating the profits and the investors are simply writing a check and they're going home and you're providing the returns, that is what a security is. And that's, as a beginner, it's the biggest misconception and the biggest mistake, because people go out there and say, well, I just want to go buy a building. I'm going to go talk to a couple of my friends, or maybe you meet somebody at an event and you simply put it together, not thinking about securities laws. And I understand that. It doesn't necessarily make a logical connection. But anytime you take money from passive investors, you're going to be issuing a security. And it doesn't matter what you call it. One of the biggest misnomers, and again, I think the first-time syndicators don't realize it. I think the more seasoned syndicators maybe know about it and are trying to get around the rules. But again, whether you call it a syndication, whether you call it a joint venture, and I want to talk a little bit about joint ventures, because that's one of the, again, it kind of all falls into this umbrella of not realizing that you're issuing securities. People call things joint ventures all the time, and they'll call me up and say, Mauricio, I'm trying to, I'm putting this deal together. I'm collecting monies from, a bunch of people, but it's not a security. It's not a syndication. It's a joint venture. And again, I always go back to this theory that it doesn't matter what you call it. The SEC or the regulators are going to look at specifically what you're doing. They're going to analyze the actual structure, the actual roles and responsibilities of the project, and they're going to make a determination whether you're selling a security or not. It's really not your, you don't have the authority to call it a security or not. It actually reminds me of sort of just a little bit of a tangent, but here in the US, it was a big thing with Uber and Lyft, you know, whether you're an employee or an independent contractor, right? You don't get to make that call. You can call somebody an independent contractor, but at the end of the day, the labor department is going to look at your situation. They may reclassify that arrangement as an employee, even though you're calling it an independent contractor. So same thing here. Just because you call it a joint venture doesn't mean it's not a security. And again, what we're looking at is whether people are passive or active, or whether you're doing all the work. So in order for a joint venture to be a legitimate joint venture, by definition, based on our definition, everybody has to be actively involved in the business. So many times I hear people saying, oh, it's a joint venture, but at the end of the day, they're doing all the work, they're putting the deal together, they're basically collecting the monies, and they're making all the decisions. And just because you call it a joint venture doesn't mean anything. So you want to make sure if you are doing a joint venture, because I want to make sure that I'm providing some value, not just telling you what you cannot do, but I want to show you how you properly structure it to avoid the security. If you're going to do a joint venture, you've got to make sure, number one, everybody is actively involved, right? There's no one person doing all the work and other people just writing a check and going home. Everybody has to be involved. I would probably limit that to 5 people or less. Once you get to 6, 7, 8, 9 people in a deal, it's really hard to argue that one of them isn't just writing a check and not doing anything. You don't usually need 10 people to do a real estate deal. You usually can do it with 2, 3, or 4 people. So if you're going to do a joint venture, limit it to 5 people. Make sure that the voting rights match up with your ownership. Like if a joint venture person puts in $100,000 and they own 25% of the project, make sure they have, number one, 25% of the distributions, and more importantly, make sure they have 25% of the vote. Now, again, you can have a manager to run the day-to-day operations, but all of the major decisions, because again, you're trying to make everybody actively involved. All of the major decisions, like, you know, whether to buy obviously purchasing the deal, selling the deal, you know, refinancing the deal, you know, hiring and firing the property manager. I mean, all those major key decisions need to be in the operating agreement and allow everybody to have a say, a vote, proportionate to their ownership. And so that's really important. And if all those things apply, maybe the last thing I forgot, one other thing is you want to make sure that all the joint ventures know a little bit about, or a lot about, real estate. If it's a real estate deal, or if you're doing a startup, make sure that they know something about it, because again, the idea is they're going to be actively involved. If they've never done a real estate deal, they couldn't tell you the first thing about buying a single family home, then you arguing that they're actively involved in helping you generate the profits when they don't know anything about real estate, it's going to be a little bit harder. So make sure they're coming to the table, to the joint venture, with some skills, because at the end of the day, a joint venture is a partnership. So those are kind of my trick. But again, calling it a joint venture alone isn't gonna cut it. We have to make sure that everybody's actively involved. So that's another mistake, a big mistake people make, is again thinking that the structure matters. Another way people like to get around, or think they're getting around the securities laws, which is one of the big mistakes, is doing a promissory note. For some reason, people think, hey, this is not equity. I'm not giving them a piece of the company. I'm just doing a loan. I'm collecting monies, and I'm going to pay everybody an 8% return or a 12% fixed promissory note, right? And again, the structure, I'm going to sound like a broken record, the structure itself doesn't matter. The question becomes, you know, are you raising capital where the returns are being generated by your efforts? And if the answer is yes, then that's a security. If you look at the definition of a security under the SEC rules, the Securities Act, it's right there in the definition. The third word out there is a security includes a note. So a note, almost by definition, is a security that you can then sort of come back and argue that it's not, but it's going to start with the presumption that it is a security. The only time a note by definition is not a security is actually if it's less than 9 months. So if you're doing a short-term loan with one person, that's important. But if somebody loans you money and it's a 6-month deal or whatever, that by definition is not going to be considered a security. And so a lot of people use that structure when they're doing flips, when people buy single-family homes or whatever they're buying, and they need capital to just kind of do the improvements, and the plan is to then sell the property 3 months from there or 6 months from there. Then you could see a scenario where somebody can come in and write a check and do a promissory note. Ideally, it's secured by the property, but if not, at least it's less than 9 months, and that by definition is not a security. But any other promissory note by definition is going to be a security, and we're going to have to rely on what's called this family resemblance test. I don't want to get too technical here, but it's a little bit of a different analysis than our normal securities of whether this is a security or not. And there's about 6 or 7 things that we look at, categories, and if it resembles one of these categories, then the argument is it is a security, but we've kind of rebutted that presumption that it's a security. And for us, and when I say us, the real estate folks, the closest one we come to is any note that is secured by a mortgage on a home, right? So that's probably the one that we rely on the most. If you're getting a loan that is then secured in first position on real estate, we would make the argument that that is not a security, because even though technically it's a note, if for whatever reason they don't pay the note, in theory, I can then go through the process and I end up with the real estate itself. So it's almost like I'm making an investment in the real estate directly, because at the end of the day, if I don't get paid, that's what I'm going to end up with. But sometimes people want to put second or third positions on there, and I'm not so sure. I'm certainly not as confident in that scenario that note would not be a security. So if you're in that scenario, I think you just end up, the solution to that, I think, is you just end up making sure that your investors you treat it as a security. You just make sure your investors are accredited, and with accredited investors, with one or two people, especially with a note, there's very little disclosure requirements that we do. So typically, if I get those scenarios, we just treat it as security, and it's not a huge deal. But anyway, I think I've belabored the point. The big mistake, like I said, number one mistake, is people not realizing that they're selling securities, whether they're beginners and they don't know any better, or if they're a little bit more advanced and they just think that by changing the structure somehow they're going to get around the security law. None of that could be further from the truth. Anytime you're taking money from investors where the returns are being generated by your efforts, you are dealing with a security. So that's kind of number one. Number two is the issue of advertising. That's become a huge issue, at least here in the US. And to give you a little bit of context with that, Gavin, once you realize that you're issuing securities, once you realize that's what you're doing, then, as I like to say, and I think we've talked about this before in the show, there's three things we worry about, or three things we have to consider. Number one, we have to register that security with the SEC, or we need to find an exemption to registration. Or, as I like to say, number three, it's illegal. So register, find an exemption, it's illegal. And when we always talk about you don't want to register your syndication. That just takes a lot of time. That's basically going public, and that's going to cost too much money and take too much time. So we're not registering, and we're certainly not doing anything illegal. So we're looking for an exemption, which is the world I live in. That's what I deal with. My whole purpose in my work life is to help clients find the right exemption and then follow the rules of that exemption. The most popular one of these exemptions is part of these Reg D, Regulation D exemptions, which you've heard of, Reg D. And the most popular one is a 506B, as in boy. 506B, and I promise this is as technical as we're going to get, but a 506B exemption is by far the most popular exemption out there. I think 90 to 95% of people will rely on this exemption. And one of the big limitations on this exemption is that you cannot advertise, which is why I come back to this advertising thing. These are meant to be private securities offerings for people you already know, your friends, your family, people in your network. You're not supposed to be able to go out and advertise to the public, because if that were the case, then it's in theory, a public offering. So you're prohibited from advertising, and you're prohibited from generally soliciting. And generally soliciting means I can't go to a conference, that has thousands of people and just go start meeting people and hand out my business plan, or have a booth and just pass out stuff like that. I have to have, and generally speaking, I have to have what's called a pre-existing substantive relationship with my prospective investor in order for it to not count as advertising. But the issue that comes up, which is by far the second most common mistake, I think, is for some reason with social media, people don't realize that they are advertising. They tend to post on social media. Some people post about their deals, and clearly that's not allowed. You're not allowed to go on social media. You're not allowed to go on podcasts. You're not allowed to go, I can't come on this channel and talk about, if I'm doing a 506B, and talk about my investment. Hey, I'm raising $1 million to do whatever I'm going to go do. I can't do that because that would be advertising. Some people do that directly. Then that's part of the problem. But I think most people get that. Like, hey, you can't advertise. I get it. I can't go on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or a podcast and talk about my deal. But where people get hung up on is there's this concept called conditioning the market. And according to the SEC, just like the definition of a security is really broad, the definition of an offer of a security, which is what the SEC regulates, the offer and sale of securities, is also extremely broad. And it not only includes talking or making direct offers to the public about your investment, but it also includes anything that gets people excited, anything that drums up excitement about your deal, even though you don't talk about your deal specifically. That can be considered conditioning the market. You're kind of preparing the market for when you do have a deal in the future. You're just getting people pumped up, and conditioning the market is another way that the SEC views as an offer and is prohibited under 506B. And that's where I see the most issues. I see people who have active deals going on, they're raising money, and they're making posts or going on podcasts, and maybe the podcast isn't meant to talk about their investment, they're talking about their journey, they're talking about what they do, but inevitably that podcast starts somehow going into the direction of, oh yeah, by the way, I do have a fund, and I am raising money, and if you're interested, give me a call. That's prohibited under the SEC rules. In addition to that, even if you don't talk about your deal and say, look, I'm a pretty good syndicator, I tend to give my investors 12% returns or 15% returns, or kind of talking about those past performances to get people excited, so that when you do have a deal, they'll be like, hey, that Mauricio guy, I saw him on the podcast, or I saw him on a social media post, and he obviously knows what he's doing, and so I'm going to pick up the phone and call. That's conditioning the market. And I think that's why so many people are violating these rules, because they don't think about they probably don't know about this conditioning of the market. So my recommendation, bottom line, is that if you have an active deal that's a 506B or any other exemption that prohibits advertising, my recommendation is to stay off social media. You don't want to run the risk. I mean, this is such gray area, right? I mean, what does conditioning the market mean? What is getting somebody excited? I mean, where do you draw the line? It's a very gray area, which is why I think it's dangerous. But I just say stay off social media. If you have an active deal for those, that month period or 2-month period that you're raising capital, post about your cats and your dogs and your kids and your vacations, that's fine. But if you're raising money for a real estate project, just stay off social media. That's not the time for you to go get new investors anyway. The time to get new investors is when you don't have a deal, either before a deal or in between deals. But at least you'll avoid the pitfalls of maybe saying something in one of those posts, even though you didn't really intend it to be conditioning the market. Somebody can interpret it as being conditioning the market, and I think it's just not that difficult. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use social media to your benefit, and so I want to give you a couple pieces of advice, maybe not advice, suggestions on the social media thing before we move on to the third and final biggest mistake. But in general, the SEC has been very clear that you are allowed to post things about yourself and your company, like factual information about what you do, almost like your resume or your company's resume. There's nothing wrong with telling people, hey, this is what I do. I'm a real estate investor, and we help clients acquire these properties, and all these factual information. I'm even comfortable, talking, showing people, deals that you've already acquired that you're not raising capital for. A lot of people are doing value adds, and if you want to show them, the progress of value add, hey, look, we just put in a new pool, or we just painted the outside of the building, and I'm just showing you factual information about this deal, then that's probably, again, assuming you don't have an active deal. This is all assuming you don't have an active deal. Then that's going to be fine. And obviously, talking about your expertise and how many deals you've done, all that kind of stuff is factual information. That's a little bit boring, but that's something you can totally do. But the real way to use social media, and I think the most effective way to use social media, is by adding value. Right? There's nothing wrong let me just say it first. There's nothing wrong with putting together a report or doing a webinar or a podcast that just talks about real estate. That's what you're into. Why real estate is the great asset class of all times. There's nothing wrong with putting together a report that says, why Jacksonville, Florida is the greatest market to invest in. I just saw an amazing, I'm going to steal it from some of my presentations. I saw an amazing report that was titled something along the lines of 101 questions that all passive investors should ask their syndicators, or something like that. And in order to get a copy of that report or those questions or the ebook or whatever it is you're doing, it's okay to request information, an email address, right? We call these lead magnets. And then once you get that lead magnet legally through some value add proposition, then you just take steps, and there's about 6 or 7 steps you need to go through, but there's steps that you can take, which maybe, Gavin, we could talk about in one of these future shows, where you can take a complete stranger that you've never met before, that you got off social media because you gave them something of value and they gave you their email address in exchange, to then take them from a complete stranger to having what we call a substantive relationship, so that you can then offer them a future deal, because you must have a pre-existing substantive relationship, which means pre-existing your current deal. So you still would not be able to, anybody that you interact with or get a hold of or get into conversations with, that you just met while you have a deal, they wouldn't be eligible for that deal anyway. But a future deal, they might be able to be eligible if you've gone through the process of getting to know thy customer almost, get to know them and let them get to know you. But that's how you really get, from a marketing standpoint, get new people on your list. Just keep adding value, add value. You know, you guys here on the show do a great job of doing that. And so it's podcasts, webinars, reports, you know, anything that is valuable enough that the person on the other end would want to give you their contact information in exchange for that piece. And then from there, you do all that stuff. So anyway, that's number one. So number one is just not knowing what a security is, not understanding that what a security is and the way you're structuring it is violating the rules. Number two is advertising. By far, that's the second most. And the third one is interesting because it's also one of the most prevalent. It's the one that's being violated the most, I think, at least the one that the SEC is really paying attention to, and that is compensating people to raise money for you. Right? It's very, what's the word I'm looking for? Tempting, for lack of a better word, to pay people referral fees, or when people approach you as you're trying to raise a large amount of money, when people approach you and say, hey, I can bring in 3 or 4 investors, you know, and help you towards your raise, it just, you know, just give me a little bit of the deal, or give me a piece of the deal, or give me some compensation in exchange for me bringing these investors to your deal. When you're raising large amounts of money, it's very tempting, but you've got to remember that you cannot pay anyone compensation for raising capital unless they have a what's called a broker-dealer license here in the US. So if they're just like you can't practice medicine without a license, you know, just like you can't practice law without a law license, you cannot go raise money for other people without a license, and a FINRA, FINRA license. And of course, nobody in our world that's doing that, they don't have that license. And so all of those payments, whether they're cash payments or most likely they're percentages of the deal, right? If you come in and bring me X amount of money to my deal, I'll give you 5% of the deal or 3% of the deal. And the most egregious ones are, the more money you bring in, the more percentage of the deal you get. So that type of what we call transaction-based compensation is prohibited, but yet it's pretty prevailing. At least it was pretty prevailing. I do want to say, I think maybe 18 months ago, and maybe it's coincidental with a lot of us securities lawyers talking about it and bringing it up. People, I think, are starting to realize that they couldn't do that. But the SEC is actually very interested in this topic, and there's numerous investigations going out right now on syndicators who have been allegedly engaged in this practice of bringing in what we call money raisers to help them raise capital, and in exchange for that, give them a percentage of the deal without them really doing real work. Essentially, they're just there to raise the money, and therefore their compensation is clearly based on that money raising. So that's kind of the third biggest mistake. And the reason I paused at the beginning is it is pretty prevalent still, and I'm hoping that with these SEC investigations, we get a little bit of clarity on what is and what isn't allowed. But literally 3 weeks ago, Gavin, the SEC came out with a proposed rule, actually, a sort of a finder's rule, or really an expansion of the finder's rules. But it will allow, if passed, it will actually allow people to compensate now people who refer investors over. And this literally happened about 3 weeks ago now, and it's just early in the stage. But the proposed rule, which is going to go through a comment period, and we'll probably come out with the first official ruling, so the preliminary rules, I'm guessing, maybe even the first quarter of next year. And then there's also a long process. And, you know, we probably, if we even get a final rule, it probably won't happen until middle or later next year. But if the final rule looks anything like what this proposal looks like, it's really exciting, because number one, you're going to be able to start paying people transaction-based compensation for them to refer you people. And they're going to be able to get a little bit more involved than usual with finders. They're going to be able to participate in the meetings. You know, so I may be somebody who has a relationship. I can make that introduction to someone. I can participate in the meetings. I can go through documents with them. I can actually be involved somewhat in the process. And in exchange, once they invest in that deal, I can actually get compensated based on that amount of transaction-based compensation, which is really exciting. The main limitation so far that I've seen is that it is going to be limited to, or the proposed rule is limiting it to, accredited investors only. So I can only refer and get compensated if I'm sending you an accredited investor, and I'm not able to, you know, advertise for that. I can't go out to the marketplace and look for investors and then bring them in and then just make the referral. I have to already have a relationship with them where they have to be in my network, and then I'm going to be able to then make an introduction. And actually, the one that I like a lot about this, you know, I have a lot of clients actually who are either CPAs or lawyers, and so they're able to connect people together. And until now, they can't get compensated for that. Let's say you're a CPA and you have a client who needs a tax deduction, and you start referring them to other clients who they know are syndicators. You can make that introduction, you just can't get paid for it. If this proposed rule becomes final, then that's something that they're potentially going to be able to get paid, as long as they're accredited investors, so long as they already have a relationship with them. And obviously it's all got to get disclosed, right? I mean, that's a big deal. Disclosing that they were getting compensated for making the referral goes a long way. But anyway, those are kind of exciting things. But those are basically the three things. So just to wrap it up, Gavin, I'll send it over to you again. Number one is just making sure that one of the biggest mistakes is not understanding what a security is and thinking you're not doing it. Number one is advertising when you're not supposed to be advertising, and number three is paying money raises or referrals for push money over.
No, that's valid. I made some points as you were speaking, which I think we should go over just for the viewers at home. So I think the first thing is you said is quite right. A lot of people are issuing securities without even realizing that they're doing it. And I know last time when we spoke, this doesn't just comply with the real estate sector. It also complies with a lot of, technology companies and other different types of businesses. It applies across the board, irregardless. As long as you offer something in return for a return, it falls under the SEC rules. Maybe a different category of it, but it's definitely something. And I do want to say that to our viewers, it is something that you guys should know.
Yeah, just to comment on that, 99% of my clients are in the real estate world, but I always like to say Facebook, like a lot of startup companies, like Facebook used to be, they need capital, right? And they go out to the marketplace and they go raise money for their next round and whatever. Yeah. And if they go out and just, again, they may think, hey, it's my Uncle Johnny over here or my Aunt Karen who's giving me $100,000 and it's no big deal. That is a securities offering.
No, definitely. So I think they really need to understand the securities law in the category that they're looking to do their work in. The other thing is putting together a deal, even if it's passive, it still complies with SEC, is a big one. So people need to make a note of that. The other one that I thought was really interesting is when you brought up about the JV venture, which kind of, I'm going to come to this towards the end of the conversation because I want to bring up something with you, a real case study that I have right now, where, anybody who's involved in a JV, as long as there's something in return, you have to be actively involved in it for it to be considered a JV deal. It's not just, hey, I could bring this, I could bring that, I could bring that, and then, it complies. So that was quite cool. And you said it's a, max 5 people in order for it to really, be worth something for them to look at. The voting rights as well, they must have voting rights in the company as equally to the shares that they have, is also an important one. The other thing that you talked about was a promissory note still falls into SEC rules. That was something that I don't know how much people are aware of it, but I think it's becoming more and more apparent now. A promissory note, unless it's less than 9 months, like if it's a loan for a flip, as you said, then definitely, it could work. You could work that around. Also, you mentioned the notice secured against a house as a first kind of port of action is also a way that it can, I don't want to use the word get around the SEC rules, but it has to be first, I guess, secured against a house before it is somebody else. That's something for you guys as well at home to look at. And then really, you talked about the exemption rules, the Reg D and the 506B is the most one that you come across a lot, but it means that there is no advertising. Now, I am on Facebook all the time and Instagram and stuff, as you can imagine. So I'm always seeing people, advertising these things. And I belong to so many real estate groups now. It's funny. And I'm looking at now, listening to what you're saying, and I'm thinking, wow, I wonder if the government really does pay attention to this, or even if Facebook should put a rule in there that talks about this, because there is so many people on there that is potentially opened up to a lawsuit right now if they were to find out.
And remember, sometimes you don't know what exemption they're relying on. So if they're relying on other exemptions, that there are other exemptions, we didn't talk about them, but there are other exemptions that do allow you to advertise, like yes. A 5C, for example, or maybe a regulated crowdfunding or a Reg A. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are others. So if that's the case, then you're fine. Go do that. But in my experience, well, not my experience, the statistics show 95% of people are using 506B, which means they shouldn't be advertising, but yes. know they're doing it.
No, definitely. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Social media is a big no I made on my note here. It's a big no. Even drumming up excitement is a big no as well for people. And there's nothing wrong with, you said, if the one thing you could do on social media is advertise your company's profile, the previous history, what you've done. That's all legit and it's all fine. And if you were to use a lead capture form, you have to build a relationship with somebody. From what I understand, was a 5-point touch relationship before you could even mention anything about stuff with them.
It used to be, we should talk about that in a future episode, but there's no longer, it actually used to be a 3-touch rule. There's like a 3-touch rule or a 30-day cooling off period. The SEC said none of that matters. It's all about, they want you to foster a relationship. There has to be a relationship that's going back and forth. That might take a couple of days. It might take a couple of years. There's no real magic timeline to that.
Yeah. And I think kind of really what that really shows is it takes us back to the old days of doing business. When people will shake hands, they'll come and meet you, they'll take you out for a coffee. They basically romance you and date you for like a few months before they even do the deed, as we would say, instead of just jumping in bed with you, right? So that's a good way of looking at it, really, more than anything else. And then, even meeting somebody at an event, even though you build a relationship with them at that event, they cannot invest in your fund, but in a future fund, probably yes, because comes back to that relationship building rules, which is something that I could imagine. Because when I was in Houston for many years ago, I lived there and I was attending a lot of events. A lot of people meet at these events strictly to raise capital and raise money. So that's a big no. I mean, of course, everybody I know, I'm going to probably say, hey guys, be careful what you're doing.
And I know, and Karen, from first experience, I mean, I go to these events all the time. I'm speaking at most of these events. So I meet people, exchange business cards, and lo and behold, a few weeks later, I get an email from these people. I've never, other than that, I don't even remember who they are. I don't know them at all. And they're offering me a deal because we met at some event, but clearly we don't have a substantive relationship. And so that's some of the things you've got to be careful about when you're doing a 506B. It's really meant to be a private offering with you and the people in your network that already exists.
Yes, no, definitely. And the last thing really is a broker license is the only way for you to get around getting a referral fee or percentage of the company. And that is based on that is something that I actually wasn't aware of, a broker-dealer license. That's something maybe we can discuss at another show. What is a broker-dealer license? What it looks like? What does it mean for the person who wants to do it? So I think for all the viewers who are looking at this, definitely, if that's what you want to do, you should look into this. We will possibly be looking at doing a show on that topic eventually in the future. And then the last thing that I want to bring the real case study to you, because we're actually putting together, as you know, a version of the Shark Tank show here on GCRE. And the idea of it is if a deal is done in the tank, as we would call it, GCRE will get a success fee for it. So let's say $1 million was done in the tank, we get a 1% commission on that. How would that be still falling under? Because there will be money that has been raised for a real estate deal. How would you sort of rate that as a real case?
If that was in the US, that would be what we call if it's transaction based, that's really the hallmark. So the first question you have to ask yourself is the compensation model transaction based, meaning the only time you get compensated is if you have a successful transaction on the other side. And if you're describing it, if you were in the US, that sounds like transaction based compensation to me, which is the hallmark of broker dealer activity. So if that were the case, you'd want to make sure that you have a broker involved in that transaction somehow so that the payment is going to the broker. And I'm not sure how that then gets compensated to you, but that's the issue. But what you can absolutely do is change the structure. Like, so for example, if you're charging people for actually coming on, you're creating a platform, which is great, right? You're matching people who have deals with people who have money, and you're creating that platform, and you're hands off on that platform. You're not giving any recommendations. You built the platform and you're providing that service, and you get compensated for that, which probably needs to be, everybody needs to, pay whether they get a deal funded or not, something along those lines. So it's not transaction based. That's where you'll be able to do it. Otherwise, you'd want to make sure you have a broker dealer involved, unless we're having this conversation 18 months from now where this new rule might be coming out, which may allow you to make, if you could argue you're making a referral to these folks and then you're getting compensated. In your case, you can't advertise. So that'd be an interesting way to, how did you get those investors? But safe, I would look into the broker dealer rules and maybe get a broker involved in the middle there, so that a legitimate broker fee, transaction based compensation can be paid.
Yes. Yeah, I thought that would be an interesting one to bring to you, because it's kind of different to what everybody else is looking. We just provide on a platform and we think, hey, we got to make money as well, right? Like everybody's thinking, hey, I got to make money. Well, we just provide on a platform. If a deal is done, we should be compensated for it as well. So that's interesting how you position it. But Mauricio, that's all I have for today. It's always an honor to have a chat with you. If anybody wants to get hold of you, what's the best way, just so that we can kind of have it on the show here?
The easiest way these days, actually, as you know, I've got that book that came out, which is where we talked about chapter 1, which is what we just talked about. It's called The 5 Things Every Syndicator Must Know to Stay Out of Jail. And if you send me an email at jail@premierlawgroup.net, not only will you get that automatically, but I'll get that email. It's probably the best way to get a hold of me these days.
Yes. So it's jail@premierlawgroup.net.
premierlawgroup.net.
Okay, cool. Well, Mauricio, it was always nice having a chat with you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day in California. And good luck with the elections out there. It's a bit crazy right now.
Thank you. Thanks.
And we'll speak again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Gavin.
Okay, take care. Have a good one.